All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. We may have some others who will be joining us, but we want to make sure this is an important topic, and we want to make sure that we have more than enough time to discuss this. This is something that I think we could discuss for hours, just because it's so relevant, and also not only relevant to ULI and ULI's mission, but especially relevant in the current environment that we're in with the pandemic and the effects of COVID on the commercial real estate environment. So I'm going to kick us off, and then I'm going to pass it over to Michael Laird, who will be our host today. So just a little housekeeping thing. We do have the chat feature open. So if you will submit questions that you have along the way in the chat box, we will be addressing those questions after some panel discussion. And so feel free to, as those come up, throw them in the chat. They'll be, most of those will be coming directly to me. And so we will see those as they come in. Also, this session is being recorded. So if you'd like to go back and watch again, or if you know of others who would be interested in this discussion, please feel free to send them the link. If you go to ULI Oklahoma's website through our events page, you will see the link through that page after we are finished. And so feel free to pass this far and wide, because this is something that we hope that people are able to use for their own good in navigating the current environment. So Michelle, you can go along. My name is Cameron Brewer. I'm the current chair of ULI Oklahoma. Been chair since for about 14 months now, and will be through the basically through next summer. And it's been a pleasure to serve as chair. ULI is close to my heart, and part of the reason is that we're really all about education and bringing people together to discuss topics like we're doing today. We look at leaders across the field to determine best practices to help the community, and that's exactly what our topic is doing today. We're looking at resilient communities, thriving communities, and it's times like these that serve as the best test for that, and also ULI allows our members and non-members to be a conduit for information like we're discussing today. So thank you for everyone who's joining. If you are not a ULI member, feel free to reach out my way. I'd be happy to talk to you about the organization and other events and things that we do as an organization. Want to thank our sponsors. None of this would be possible without our sponsors. One of our sponsors is Crow & Dunlevy, and Michael Laird and Carrie Hoffines are here today as part of our moderator and panel. They've been a longtime sponsor of the organization, but every sponsor on this list is essential to what we do. Each of our panelists are represented on the sponsor list as well, and we can't thank you enough, especially in times like this where sponsorship is, we know that it's not an easy thing to allocate money to organizations, but we appreciate that you care about the discussions we're having and what we bring to the community, and we ask for your continued support in that regard. So thanks again. Just a few upcoming events. We have a fun event that we're going to do that's going to be through virtually through Zoom, Downtown Development Trivia, and we're putting together that event right now. We're putting together our questions, and we have some fun ones in there. That's hosted by our Young Leaders Group, and we hope that you're able to attend that on September 3rd. And then kicking off on September 15th is our Copenhagen Eyes book club. Copenhagen Eyes is the name of the book. It's a lot of it's centered around biking culture in Copenhagen, and registration for that book club is open. That's going to be an event. It's going to meet over 3 different sessions, and we are trying to be as careful as possible. We're limiting registration to 30 people. And we're also hosting we're going to be hosting each of our meetings outside at Kerr Park. We encourage those who do attend, if you're able to ride your bike, if that makes sense to do, to ride your bike and kind of join in on the discussion in that regard. And then, yeah, and I just got a question. Is trivia open to everyone? It is open to everyone. So please, all members are able to attend that event. But yeah, with the book club, we encourage you to be a part of that discussion. We just want to further the discussion of biking culture and bike improvements in Oklahoma City and Oklahoma City Metro. And that should be really fun. And again, we will keep it as safe and social distance as possible. And again, it's being hosted outside. So then lastly is the 2020 ULI virtual fall meeting. October 13th through 15th. You can go through our website to learn more about that, what's being hosted as part of that virtual meeting. And then we have a number of other events that we have planned in the works, and you'll be hearing about those soon. So I am not going to introduce the whole panel. In fact, they're going to introduce themselves, but I am going to introduce Michael with just a brief introduction. Michael is the managing director for Crow and Dunlevy, has been a longtime member of ULI, actually one of the founding members, and has been integral to everything we do. Michael is one of the best commercial real estate attorneys that we have in this state. And we are so thrilled to have him as our moderator today. I've known Michael for several years, and there is no one more knowledgeable than what he's bringing to the table with this discussion here. So much so that the idea for this event came directly from him. So we said, sure, we'll host you as long as you're moderator, and we'll host your idea. But no, we're excited to have him, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it over his way. And then again, we will have Q&A. Submit your questions to the chat box, and we'll join in on for the panel discussion on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cameron. I appreciate your kind words. Yes, let's introduce the rest of the panel. And why don't we go ahead and start with Carrie Hoffines and work our way down.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carrie Hoffines. I am a commercial real estate and banking attorney at Crow and Dunlevy. Excited to be on the panel today and tell you guys a little bit about landlords, tenants, and COVID.
Allison?
Hi, I'm Allison Bailey. I am an agent at Price Edwards and Company, and I focus mainly on urban core, walkable retail, mixed-use buildings, historic rehabilitation projects in the urban core, and do a little bit of small office leasing as part of those projects in addition to retail.
Gurma?
Hi, I'm Gurma Moaning. I'm at Price Edwards. Focus on retail leasing, retail investment, sales, and development.
Travis?
Travis Mason, work for Cushman Wakefield, and I lease office space for a living.
Okay. We're going to start out with throwing a handful of questions out just to the panel generally. And so jump in and answer, and we can have multiple answers if that's appropriate as well. And we'll just click through 5 or 6 of those questions before we get to specifics. So the first one is, what trends were we seeing prior to COVID, and how have those trends changed?
Michael, I'll start off on this one. I was seeing a lot of new leasing, and specifically new retail, entertainment, and gym leasing. And now, on the flip side of COVID, it's been a lot of lease workouts. In some cases, with those tenants where we were just negotiating the lease, it got signed. And now, before we're even putting TI into the project, we're talking about, do we need to get out of this?
Any other thoughts? Okay, let's try the next question. What have you seen over the last 6 months that has surprised you more than anything else?
I'll take that question. This is Allison. I think at the beginning of COVID, I was thinking this is going to be devastating for our local retail tenants and some of our smaller office tenants, thinking that they would be disproportionately affected, and they may still be disproportionately affected. But I have seen a lot of new inquiries for small space and especially startup spaces. Maybe this is kind of a modest startup compared to what it would have been pre-pandemic. But I've been happily surprised that we still have optimistic tenants and optimistic business owners, considering the climate that we're in right now and the uncertainty that they have. So we're going to talk about a lot of things that are really negative for commercial real estate over the next hour, I'm sure. But that's been what has surprised me the most, is that we still have some new leases happening in different parts of the town of Oklahoma City.
Michael, it's Travis. To kind of echo Allison's comments, especially in office leasing, before COVID, you were already seeing a lot of pressure on landlords for lowering lease rates, higher TIs, more flexible lease terms. And that certainly has continued. But the most interesting thing is, we're still doing leases. Ironically, they're not all 12-month leases. And the properties that we're working on that are trading hands, there's a discount in the value of it, but I would say it's nothing drastic. So I think that speaks well to the fact that some of the properties that are exchanging hands right now, the values are actually thus far holding up quite well.
Okay. Any other takers? Okay, let's move on. What are developers or landlords offering to put their projects over another when competition for space is heating up, as Travis mentioned? Increased amenities, lower rent, free parking, other amenities?
All the above, Michael. I mean, I would say the most interesting thing that we have seen is not just free parking, TI allowances have continued to go up. I think that's been the most surprising thing we've seen, is how much a landlord's willing to participate in building out the space. One of the things we've also seen is, and I'm sure Carrie can speak to this better than I, we've seen a lot more tenant-friendly lease options, like the right to terminate the lease early, exit the lease early, things like that, that landlords are willing to do just to kind of backfill their space. And so I would just say, and then things like that we saw before that are kind of even more appealing, fully furnished options, where, we did a sublease for 18,000 square feet pre-pandemic, and the 18,000 square feet was fully furnished, and we sold the furniture, I think, for $10 for 18,000 square feet of office furniture space. So just the value of it to move and store it isn't much. So there's a lot of opportunities out there for tenants that if they are comfortable making that change or making that move right now, they certainly have a welcome audience of landlords willing to get creative.
Okay, anybody else?
To piggyback on Travis, I have seen, even before the pandemic, the tenants that are struggling a little more just based on the economy, like some of the oil and gas tenants, they were getting termination rights in their leases. The landlords recognize that, this is reality. If 5 years in or 7 years in or 10 years in, they can't continue in a cyclical market. There was an out. A lot of times with an amortized cost for a termination fee for TIs that the landlord hadn't earned out over the full term.
Okay.
One last point, Michael, on that. I'm sorry. This, I think, is maybe the more interesting thing. And to Carrie's point, we signed a lease with an oil and gas company to take a certain amount of square footage on a 7-year lease. Oh, I don't know. Last week of February. The landlord started construction, and within a month, we'd already reached out to the landlord wanting to downsize our space. And the landlord, in an effort to accommodate us, even though they started construction on the entire space and demolition, agreed to amend, and the only change to the lease terms was the square footage. So we literally, within a 30-day turnaround, took less space. That is not normal. But I think the landlord was prudent in saying, I want a happy tenant moving in. If they move in day one and they're already swimming in space, it's not going to turn out well for me. So that more to Carrie's point.
Okay.
I think to continue on that, and just a little bit of a different vantage point from the retail side, when landlords are seeing tenants that they believe in the strength of that tenant, their ability to either weather or bounce back from this, a lot of them are doing very creative things in order to ensure, one, that their existing tenants stay in place, and if there's another concept that they want within the center, if there's a way to greatly reduce the rent on the front end of the lease, but extend the term out, so they're able to get those tenants. I think that we're definitely starting to see that take place.
Yeah, a lot of free rent negotiations happening to get tenants through the winter on retail tenants, for sure. I'm seeing that.
On retail, it's kind of a sub question. Are you seeing much conversion to just percentage rent?
I'm seeing percentage rent being used as a determining factor for the landlord and tenant to be able to meet on a newly negotiated, let's call it a pandemic rent in the short term. Landlords are definitely wanting to see, I need to see everyone's gross sales to understand, do you actually need rent assistance right now, or is this something you want? And kind of how dramatically decreased are your sales, so that I, as the landlord, know how much I need to help you get through this until you can be back up to 100% occupancy. For the same reason everybody mentioned, it's much better to keep that tenant in the space, even if it's at a slightly decreased rent in the short term, and find a concession for that later to make up for it, whether it's adding term or maybe changing the rental rate at the end of their term to be able to compensate. But if they're doing 75 to 85% of their normal sales, then there's hope that they're going to make it through this, and then they'll be back up to 100% sometime in the next year. And so, you know, they're using gross revenue as a determining factor on that, for sure.
Any other thoughts on percentage rent?
Previously, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Gurma. Mine's more national, so go.
Yeah, previously, whether it was local or national tenants, there was definitely a pushback from a large number of tenants to share with the landlord what their annual sales numbers were. And I think that this is going to truly push things in a new direction, where that's going to be a standard part of many leases, where those sales numbers are shared, because there are some tenants out there that their sales have gone up 10, 15%, but there's others out there, their sales are down 80, 95%. And so as a landlord, if you're making that decision, understanding what those numbers are, and also understanding, if I give this tenant a break for the next 6 to 18 months, is this tenant going to bounce back, or is this a tenant that over the last 3 years, their sales were year over year down 10%, and I'm just basically extending the inevitable.
Yep. Travis, you have thoughts?
Yeah, the only irony is I was on a call with some of our brokers in New York last week, and I was asking kind of how is retail there, and a lot of established restaurants that are of high quality and have a great reputation are closing. And the reason for closing is inability to negotiate with their landlord, which is mind-boggling to me, because if you're an existing retail tenant in Oklahoma City locally, the landlords I've spoken to have been willing to work with those tenants in some sort of, whether it's free rent or something, to work with them so they can kind of make it through it. And so I find it interesting, kind of a more global perspective, that some of, and again, who knows what the restaurants are asking for, maybe untenable for the landlord. But I find it interesting that the reason that a lot of restaurants are closing in New York City right now. The reason they give is not COVID. The reason they give is inability to come to terms with their landlord, which I find interesting.
You know, Travis, I was also kind of seeing some articles about that. And I wondered if, you know, our rental rates in Oklahoma City, although they gradually increase, they're relatively stable. You don't see major fluctuations in either direction. And I wonder if some of these landlords are using this as an opportunity to get a tenant out of a space that's paying below market rent. So some of those long established restaurants are actually, these landlords believe that if I can just make it through this pandemic and I have 8 months of vacancy, I'm going to be able to add $10 a square foot to the rental rate that I'm asking for this space. And I haven't seen statistics on that, but I wonder if that's part of the motivation between like the second tier cities like ours have seen different amounts of restaurants closing than some of our kind of higher profile cities in the country. So I don't know. That's not a question. I mean, it's more of a question than it is a comment, but.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on like the financing and where they're at. But, one of the hardest things when you go new construction or development is you put your money into something and it sits there for 2 years and you don't get a return. And so if you have a vacancy in a space for 8 to 10 months, and I'm sure Carrie can speak to this greater, that really starts to eat in your returns of the asset and impacts your investors and impacts your ability to go raise more money. So you would think they'd want to just keep the cash coming in, but to your point, who knows? Who knows?
No, you bring up a good point, and that's really one of the next questions is, what's all this going to be doing for its impact on the banks or lenders in the world?
I'll speak to this one because as Michael knows, we represent a lot of bank clients, and I was really, really impressed with our local bankers and how they stepped up and have like implemented COVID policies, offered deferral arrangements to their landlords, and that in turn can help the landlords work with the tenants. And it's been very, very impressive. So kudos to all of our local banks that are on the line. I don't know if it's happening at a national bank level too. I imagine it has to be. The banks are in the business of lending money and taking deposits, not owning assets. So I think that they're going to do everything they can to work with landlords. Now, if there was already an issue with the loan, I'm seeing less likelihood of the lender wanting to delay the inevitable foreclosure that was probably coming down the pipe anyway. But I'm not seeing any help so far, and maybe some other people on the call have, with CMBS lenders. They haven't been willing to work at all from what I've seen. And I tried to work a deal for a hotel client and they could not make any headway. But those are pooled and sold to investors, and so their hands are tied a bit on what they can do. I do want to add that being a former banker myself, it's been several years I've been out of the industry, but examiners, they come in and they know what's going on in the market. They know what's going on in the local market. And I think that, and this is global, obviously, I think examiners are going to be willing to work with banks. Yes, are the loans going to be graded a 5 or a 6 or an 8? Yes, they're going to start looking bad, and they're going to be in special assets because that's what banks are supposed to do. But I do think that the examiners are going to work with the banks, and they aren't going to reprimand them if they're trying to work with their landlord and tenant clients alike.
Any other thoughts on banks?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. One, I know our national hospitality group, I think this was last week, Mike, they said in the last 6 months, they've seen 7 transactions of significance. So the financial lending market for hotels right now it's not on an ice block, but it's pretty darn close. So it is hard. And this gets to my other point. It is hard to get stuff financed. To be candid with you, some of these new businesses that Allison referenced a little earlier, If they don't have existing banking relationships, I am a little worried about their ability to get financing or get loans. Just the underwriting process. I know a lot of local banks just said, and we've passed that threshold, but for 60 days, they said, we're not issuing any new loans. And so even if you have existing relationships with banks, it's still like pulling teeth to get some stuff done. And I worry a little bit about people that are just kind of starting their first venture, about being able to secure the necessary financing. And then I think the third and biggest thing is we've already had banks start calling us about some of the real estate they have on their portfolio, knowing it looks okay now, but if you look at vacancy and kind of rollover for 2021, it could start to get ugly. And my last point on the banks is I will be very curious once the eviction process kind of fully kicks in, what vacancy rates look like from a housing perspective. So far, they've held strong throughout COVID. But as everyone's read in the Journal Record or nationally, I think we're about to see a big rash of that. And so I'll be curious what impact that has on lending when it comes to multifamily and some of this other financing stuff come October, November, December, when you've kind of experienced 60, 90 days of that eviction process.
Okay, last jump ball question. What are any of you seeing with respect to the marijuana market out there as far as utilization of space? Is it still very hot? Is it tempered? Is it going sideways?
The marijuana tenants for, I'd say, 6 months, the 20, 30 calls that were coming in on a daily basis dropped off to almost none. But ever since March, those calls have continued to increase on an almost weekly basis. And I think that some of the dispensaries are seeing record high sales at the moment. So that is definitely going to be an interesting portion of the market to watch, because at some point we will reach saturation, but thus far it seems like the demand just continues to grow.
Anybody else? Okay. All right. First question for Carrie. From a legal perspective, what are the top 2 or 3 lease disputes you are seeing between landlords and tenants due to the impact of COVID?
Obviously, no surprise, the biggest lease dispute has been over non-payment of rent. When the government mandated closures came down in March, landlords were nervous about what April 1st would hold. Tenants were hoarding cash. Landlords were hoarding cash. We all, I think, have been hoarding cash, even personally, as a result of COVID. And once the lease default letters started arriving for many tenants, it was a process of meandering through legal strategy to survive. So what have tenants claimed in order to withhold rent? A few different things. The first one is force majeure. And force majeure is a contractual clause in a lease that allows a tenant to be forgiven, usually temporarily, of certain obligations in the lease when something that we typically coin as like an act of God or some extraordinary unforeseen event occurs. The force majeure has been kind of a boilerplate provision at the end of the lease that nobody's paid a whole lot of attention to for years and years because it hasn't really mattered. Or at least that's what we thought. Okay, now it matters very much. A well-drafted force majeure clause will have a carve-out for monetary obligations of the parties. So notwithstanding these unforeseen events like government closures, the tenant would still be obligated to pay rent. So we're seeing fights over, tenants are claiming force majeure, landlords are claiming, no, you can't claim force majeure. Sometimes they have language to point to in the lease, sometimes they don't. Another thing I'm seeing a lot of is impracticability of performance and frustration of purpose. Those are 2 common law doctrines. They're not something you see in a lease contract. And they both essentially say that the tenant, there are elements to it. So this is not legal advice right now, but they both essentially say the tenant was unable to perform and therefore they don't have to pay rent. Those two doctrines have not been tested in leasing. And of course, nothing has been tested with a global pandemic. So literally the jury's still out on how that's going to be treated. The second main thing that I'm seeing claims of tenant, a reason to not pay rent, is co-tenancy. The hardest hit market from COVID-19 has been retail, restaurant, service, entertainment, basically what we code the retail industry. And in retail leases, it's common for a tenant, typically a heavy-handed, a higher negotiating tenant, like a large anchor, to be able to come in and say, all of these other tenants have to be open and operating. Otherwise, A, I don't have to pay rent, or B, I get to pay some substitute rent, like maybe based on my gross sales, because the retail shopping centers depend so much on foot traffic of people coming in to go to all the different retail centers. So co-tenancy has been a big one. I'm actually just now seeing those sorts of claims over the past couple of months, and they're legitimate claims in a lot of cases for tenants, and they have been an avenue for tenants to avoid paying rent.
Okay. Allison, can you speak to the difference in how landlords are viewing mom and pop shops versus national tenants in retail?
Well, I think the question is, who is creditworthy? I mean, and maybe who we thought was creditworthy before is not as creditworthy in this situation for a landlord, especially because we have a lot of local landlords in Oklahoma City. And so in the past, I think it was, we want national chains, we want national credit. We think that our bank wants that, and that creates a more stable asset for us. But when the pandemic started, our local tenants, their first reaction is to pick up the phone and call their landlord and say, here's the situation I'm facing. How can we make this work? And so they're offering a solution of some sort, whether it's a negotiated rent or, you know, some deferment or something like that. A lot of the national tenants had their attorneys send a letter to the landlord and say, we're not paying rent, get in line, we'll figure it out later. And so local landlords are like, well, at least the local tenants are working with me. And I think they're trying, and you can see that they're hustling to keep their business open and to do what they can to fulfill their lease obligations. And obviously that's a generalization. There are some that aren't, but for the most part, local tenants have their livelihood and their personal wealth is tied up in their own business. So they kind of have to do that. And I even down to personal guarantees, you know, who is a credit-worthy person to guarantee a lease anymore, and how are those leases guaranteed? So landlords have seen maybe a little bit more flexibility with local tenants trying to make rent obligations work. And I typically have landlords that prefer a mix of local and national tenants or regional tenants, but they've been very happy with their local tenants this summer. So
good to know. Gurma, restaurants and music venues seem to have been most heavily impacted businesses during COVID. Can you talk about how COVID has impacted the industry generally in restaurants and how long-lasting the impacts will be? And also, what have you heard about the number of restaurants, the percentage of restaurants that will really never reopen?
So I think when you look at this question, there are several different things to consider. I think number one, you'd have the just general risk factor of large amounts of people congregating in a single space. I think that additionally, there was some level of mandated government shutdown in certain locations that impacted restaurants greatly. And then the market in general. Owning and operating a restaurant is something that a lot of people romanticize about. It's definitely a lot of hard work. In any given year within the restaurant industry, there's churn with concepts opening and closing. So the restaurant industry is probably going to see at minimum 30% of concepts closing. I don't know that in the big picture, when you look at it from a 5-year perspective, if that's going to have that great of an impact on the total number of operational restaurants. But in the short term, there's going to be a lot of impact, especially concepts that are larger or ones that are in locations where they can't easily pivot how they serve their customers.
Okay. Travis, can you talk a little bit about the office market, maybe the Oklahoma City office market specifically, and what you're seeing in terms of trending that you haven't already talked about?
Sure. Well, simple answer is vacancies going up, rents are going down. But, I think there's to be honest with you, Michael, I think there's a lot of positive news that's going on in the office market right now. I think the government or whatever entity you want to call it that's buying the Sandridge Tower, that's 500,000 square feet that will no longer be vacant. That's a big deal. Costco buying the Hertz facility at Memorial Corridor was a big deal. That was a lot of vacancy that Hertz was no longer using. And even Chesapeake, we continue to see a lot of interest from prospects that are interested in occupying space there. So under the backdrop that things are tough out there, there's a lot of good things that are happening. We see some tenants that are still willing to pull the trigger and still willing to move and sign, commit to something more than 12 months or 2 years. And then some markets, I would say, are being relatively resilient in their pricing. MacArthur and Memorial area continues to be a relatively resilient part of our market. Midtown, if you see it like releasing spaces or sublets, it's still relatively strong. So I think locally, we're in a little bit of a bind, and I think we'll continue to be in a bind over the next through next year. I hope I'm wrong. I typically am. So, there are good things that are happening out there.
Okay. Back over to Carrie. How are existing landlord and tenant relationships moving forward generally, and what sorts of workout arrangements are you seeing?
I'm really seeing 3 different courses taken by landlords. 100% of the workouts that I've worked on have been retail tenants, so I can only speak to that. But landlords are being very, in my experience, sympathetic with the solo mom-pop type tenants. And what I'm seeing from that perspective is landlords are offering to abate the rent that's now several months delinquent. Sometimes they'll go ahead and collect triple nets, the operating expenses that are actually incurred by landlord under the lease, and just abate base rent. And other times it'll be a complete abatement of all rent. It's really just dependent heavily on what the tenant needs. In almost all cases where it's a retail tenant, I'm seeing the landlord requiring gross sales. They have to see where sales are to add on to something. I think maybe Allison said earlier, or Germa, that's been requested in every single case so that they can determine if it's actually needed. A lot of times in exchange for that, and I think I'm piggybacking on another thing Allison said earlier, landlords are asking for extension of the lease term, at least 1 year up to 5 years in exchange for the abatement. The abatement is oftentimes couched as a conditional abatement, so which means that rent will be forgiven if the tenant otherwise fully performs for the remainder of the lease term. It allows making the abatement conditional. It's conditioned upon no default, and it would allow the landlord to claw back that lost rent in the event 2 months down the road, tenant turns around and files bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy trustee is rejecting the lease. Another course I'm seeing is deferment of delinquent rent. And in that case, it's essentially kind of set up as a loan. The tenant doesn't have to repay that or rent that's in arrearages now. Rather, they'll pay it, we'll amortize it over a longer period of time than the number of months that are actually due, so that it's something hopefully the tenant can start repaying in the next year or two whenever we get a vaccine and the economy for retail starts turning back around again on a larger basis. That's usually, the landlords are charging rent on that, but usually at a pretty nominal rate, like somewhere between I have seen 8%, but usually around 4%, which is kind of right in there with the market at the moment. And then the third thing I'm seeing is landlords not moving at all. That's usually happening with national tenants that either have the sales or are perceived to have had the sales. Landlords have been, a couple of my clients have been able to track the foot traffic in the store with a technology that I'm sure the brokers on the call are more aware of than I am. And when the tenant's saying no one's coming in, and then they're tracking, cell phone pings, and there have been multiple people in the store, or they go into the store and there's no merchandise hardly left because people have run on the store and bought everything, then, landlords aren't buying it. And, the national tenants they're hoarding cash too. They're having financial troubles too. In many cases, we're seeing lots of bankruptcies come down, and they want to be treated like the mom pops. But if they can afford it, the landlords need someone to keep paying rent so they can pay their banks. Maybe they're getting deferment from their banks, but they're likely still paying interest. The banks, don't want to capitalize interest if they can help it. And so it's kind of a card game. We're playing poker over here. Everyone's trying to call everyone's bluff, and the landlords are just now starting to file eviction proceedings over the last couple of months. And in 3 cases where we filed eviction on national tenants that are in local shopping centers that are getting lots of foot traffic, I don't know how many sales they're getting because I'm not looking at the reporting, but there's a lot of people in these stores, and they're conveniently immediately paying their rent. And then the eviction proceeding is being dismissed. So it's been a game of poker, and it's been kind of awkward, but it's always been a little bit awkward between the landlords and the nationals, even from the beginning of the lease negotiation.
True, very true. Allison, this is one of my favorite questions, so I'd be really interested to see what you have to say. What are some of creative examples of the implemented of the lighter, quicker, cheaper mentality?
Well, I'm going to take a broad look at that, but one of them has been the way that businesses are communicating with customers. This has been happening so quickly that they can't do a full ad campaign in a traditional advertising setting. As things are changing, they're posting that day's update on Instagram or on Twitter or on Facebook, and they're relying a lot on social media to convey changes in their business, whether it's format changes, menu changes, or hours of operation or protocols, et cetera. So that's kind of like a digital, lighter, quicker, cheaper thing. And I think that conversation, especially for tenants that hadn't been communicating that casually with their customers on social media, I think that will continue. But in the built environment, obviously any restaurant that can add patio space is doing it right now, because that's something that customers feel very comfortable dining in compared to indoor space. And so the city of Oklahoma City is even really pushing streeteries, although in the urban core, we don't have a lot of space to reclaim for additional patio that hasn't already been kind of thought of. But even like McNelly's, now their patio is wrapping around the side of their space so that they get shade at different times of the day, and they have more two-top seating outside. And I think the chairs that they're using outside are just chairs and tables that were up in their space right now. So they would have probably never thought of doing that prior to the pandemic. So our outdoor dining is looking a lot different. I hope that stays. I hope we see in new restaurant spaces that outdoor dining is valued a lot more. I just walked the Bricktown Canal maybe Sunday or Monday night, and every patio was completely full on the canal. Bourbon Street, Tipsy Tiki, Brickopolis, the Charleston's had people on their patios. So it was, it's bringing a lot of vitality to kind of the public space and walkable spaces. And then where can you, service businesses are asking, like, where can I operate my business to meet some of these guidelines? And yoga in the park is not just a novelty anymore. There are yoga studios that every class they did this summer was outdoors in a grassy area adjacent to their building or out in the public park or something like that. So they've tried to make it work. And I think they have, as much as they can. I've appreciated the creativity of all of our small tenants trying to find a way to continue to interact with their customers.
Okay. Gurma, with all these restaurants potentially closing up, what and who will be the backfill of these properties, the most likely candidates? And also, what submarkets do you think will bounce back quicker than others?
A very simple answer to that question is more restaurants. Diving into that deeper, if there's a restaurant that has a small footprint, if it has a drive-through, if it has the ability to do curbside pickup, or as Allison mentioned, a larger restaurant that has the capacity for a large outdoor patio, especially if they have the ability to expand that infrastructure to make it more of a all-weather type outdoor patio that you see more so in coastal cities. I think that those are going to be in high demand. There's going to obviously be shuttings. There's going to be spaces that go dark, but people, for whatever reason, love the thought of owning their own restaurants. And there's a lot of people who are going to leave the oil and gas industry, the healthcare industry, so on and so forth. And whether they go with a local concept or they go out and pick up a franchisee agreement to open up 6 of a specific concept. We saw that back in 2008, and I am going to predict that we'll see that happening in 2021, 2022, where some people are saying, well, I was a doctor or I was a whatever healthcare professional that they were, and got laid off in the middle of a pandemic. What's the point of staying in this? Or been laid off 3 times in the oil and gas industry, so let's pivot. Your larger scale restaurant spaces, for example, there's a restaurant space on Northwest Expressway that's 12,000 square foot that was more buffet style. That's where I'm gonna assume that we would see a lot more transition of spaces, because restaurant infrastructure is expensive. If you take a regular space, it's really common to easily drop. You can spend $100,000 transitioning your restaurant space quickly. And for some of the larger concepts, I've seen groups come in and easily spend over $1 million to transition that space. So if a landlord can keep it as a restaurant, they want to. But if you have a 12,000 square foot buffet, maybe you look at that and say, does this make a better dental clinic? Does this make a better small scale church? Or should we try to put a gym or something in here? There's going to be a lot of those conversations that are taking place. As far as the submarkets go, I don't think that there's going to be any specific submarket that's heavily impacted. If an area has a large hotel population and a large office population, they'll definitely see downturn because fewer people are traveling and more people are staying home. So downtown Memorial Road corridor, things like that, you will see some impacts from the reduced hotel traffic and office traffic in those areas. But if the space is the right type space, I don't anticipate those spaces staying dark for the long term.
Okay. Sort of on that spirit, Travis, and this is sort of the elephant in the room in office right now, it seems to be, is how is the market going to handle the impacts of permanent or semi-permanent working from home for a lot of companies? And how does that impact the space they need and how they use it?
Well, Michael, we're still figuring that out. You've got a lot of people that are trying to candidly work through that. I will tell you, I have heard everything from we can practically work remote and just have a place where we can come and like collaborate and have conferencing and meeting space. So we're going to cut our footprint by, 67%. to talking to people, especially in finance. I think they're actually going to need more square footage after this. I like to think we'll end up with a Hogan-Taylor model, which the Hogan-Taylor model is we're going to move from location A to location B. And relocating location B, we're going to take the exact same square footage, but we can accommodate a 35% growth in headcount. So the way the space is laid out will change. When Hogan-Taylor first moved in, there was concern, did we take enough space? And now, 8 months in the pandemic, if you talk to Richard, Richard will say, we're looking at, strategic opportunities for the firm, and we're not worried about needing more space. And so I think the idea that office space is going away is a little overblown. I think you see things like what Amazon has announced, some other bigger companies. I think you'll see that happen. And then I think, I think it'll be kind of a blended rate, and it'll depend a little bit upon what that business does and, what their focus is. Are they client facing? Are they not client facing? I can tell you, Paycom, we're taking a hard look right now at how our sales offices are set up. And so, everyone's having those conversations. There is no set answer yet, but I think in the future, if Michael Laird law firm picked up the phone and said, Trav, we're growing like a weed. Maybe 10 years ago, you would have said, I need to go from 5,000 square feet to 10,000 square feet. I think in the future, you'll say, we're going to look to upgrade our space. We need to reimagine how it looks like. And we're going to go from 5,000 square feet to 6,000 square feet. So the amount of space you take will be less, which has already been a trend. People have always looked at how do we lower our G&A costs, which is, Michael, your rental obligation is top 3 in total costs.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of businesses. And so trying to downsize or get more efficient isn't necessarily new. I think it's now more of a question of how can we envision our space moving forward in a way in which that accommodates more of a mixed approach of work from the office and work from home.
Okay. Carrie, what public programs have been beneficial to your clients, and do you see any new regulations or governmental programs coming on board that would alleviate some of the landlord pressure on these issues? You're muted.
I apologize. Thank you. I just want to run through some of the different programs that I think the ULI group will be interested in. And my clients have taken advantage of some of these programs. Under the CARES Act, we had 3 different big funding programs that were helpful to landlords and tenants. The first one was the most notorious, probably the Paycheck Protection Program. That gave small businesses a certain amount of money, about 2.5 times their monthly payroll, to be used towards things like retaining and paying employees, and then rent expense and mortgage interest and utilities. So that was a big one. And I would venture to say that every client that I had that qualified for that took advantage of that program, because that is a potentially forgivable loan if they meet the qualifications and the loan and the funds are spent appropriately. Otherwise, it's a 1% interest rate loan, so it's really just a no-brainer. Also, under the CARES Act, the government expanded by funding additional money to the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program. It ultimately was supposed to be more money per applicant. They ended up capping it at $150,000 across per applicant. But it was capped. The loan amount was based on the amount of your payroll, again, trying to get people to retain employees when the income wasn't coming in. That one also included a $10,000 grant, and the SBA shut down the program pretty early because they ran out of funding. But I checked last night, and Cameron could speak to this, but they did reopen the program back in June, and they're accepting new applications. So if you guys have tenants or landlords that are still struggling, they should look into that. I think it has the highest interest rate on that one's 3.75%. So it's still pretty cheap money. And then the third thing that the government did that was big under the CARES Act was for existing SBA loans. They offered 6 months of principal and interest forgiveness, just complete forgiveness on existing SBA loans. The big ones that you guys would probably think of and that maybe some of you in the group use are the Section 7A and the Section 504 loans. Another big tenant relief thing that came in through the CARES Act was a temporary moratorium on residential lease evictions. We're talking about commercial here. Unfortunately, we didn't have any local moratoriums on commercial lease evictions, although many states did. The thing that hindered eviction for commercial leases here locally was really just the courts being closed. Some of the other programs that are available are the Federal Reserve's Main Street Lending Program. There are certain qualifications for that as well. In fact, even the lender has to be an eligible lender, but lenders are incentivized to participate in that program if they qualify because they participated out to other lenders. So they're spreading some of the risk. And it's very attractive for borrowers because they can get up to 2 years of deferred payments on principal and up to 1 year on interest, which will be capitalized on the loan. Locally, the Oklahoma City Urban Renewal Authority, about five months ago or so, passed a small business grant program. It's also identified as the Urban Renewal Micro Enterprise Program. And there are several factors to qualify. You have to be in an urban renewal area, low to medium income owner, or more than 51% of the employees have to fit into the low to moderate income category, and 5 or fewer employees. But if you qualify, you can get a $10,000 grant. And the Urban Renewal Authority has done 2 rounds of funding of those business grants. I actually was emailing with Kathy O'Connor of the Oklahoma City Economic Alliance yesterday, and she said they've received over 600 applications. And funding is still available. So if you guys have tenants that might qualify for that, encourage them. And I've got the link. I can send you guys the link to the website where they can go apply. On Wednesday, so tomorrow, the Urban Renewal Authority will open a new program to provide up to $250,000 to grants, so forgivable, to live performance venues. So this is going to be huge for a lot of our tenants and owners alike in Oklahoma City. Something that the city of Oklahoma City has done is and Allison touched on this a little bit earlier, the streetery permits. And it's where we're trying to get people to come back to the restaurants by the city is granting revocable permits. You have to apply for it, of course. And they're allowing the dining to expand into public right-of-ways. So like the McNelly's example Allison gave is an obvious one that would work. You know, would that work for a restaurant that's like right off of the street already, like 324? I don't know, maybe. And so that's something that I hope our local restaurants are looking into and taking advantage of. And I understand that the Urban Renewal Authority is also providing grants for the businesses to retrofit themselves to become an eatery. They've received, or to qualify for the streetery permit and to have outside dining. And they've received over 100 applications for those retrofits. She didn't tell me the cap on that, but that might be the $250,000 cap. So hopefully our tenants and landlords are taking advantage of those programs. As far as new regulations coming, besides the Urban Renewal Authority thing that's coming down tomorrow, the federal government is throwing back and forth the HEALS Act and the HEROES Act. It doesn't look like anything's coming down quickly except funding the post office at the moment. So it's difficult to say where things are going. There's talk of an additional PPP funding, the Paycheck Protection Loan, for businesses that have had more than 50% decline in sales But that's, stuck up on Capitol Hill. So who will it pass? Who knows? There's also likely to be another stimulus check for individuals and families. And there's more talk on Capitol Hill of eviction moratoriums, but it appears those still will only extend to residential leases. So in my experience, just to wrap that up, when the PPP funding came through, a lot of tenants started paying their rent. And I know the landlords really appreciated that. And landlords in turn that qualified for PPP were able to make loan payments. And so that did definitely help boost the economy a bit during the COVID.
Okay. Gurma, this sort of dovetails off one of the last questions you were asked. What are landlords doing to pivot their space into other uses, and what uses are still growing at this point in a broad sense?
I love this question because I think that this is a question that we are seeing asked by landlords over and over and over again. I think there's definitely a possibility that some landlords are going to overreact and make drastic changes that are definitely unnecessary. And then there's going to be other landlords that basically see the trends are changing and they will not pivot. But got a call a couple of weeks ago from a landlord who asked, hey, we've had a couple of vacancies. What should we do about the space? And this is not something that I wanted to say, but I just had to say, look, you have 80,000 square feet in a shopping center. And since 2007, you have not put a pane of code on this building. You have not striped your parking lot, and you have trash that sits in your parking lot. As if a tenant is making a choice in today's environment, they're going to look at your center and keep driving because you as a landlord have not been proactive and done anything to attract me as a tenant to that space. So I think the general theme of this is, even though there are so many unknowns, every single landlord needs to play offense right now. Whether the capacity for you to play offense is only gaining a yard or for you to go all the way to the house, whatever you have as a capacity as a landlord, I would say right now, let's play offense. If you have local tenants and they need some changes with their space in order to be able to start offering some online options, I think that that's going to be very critical. If you have really large spaces, maybe talk with your architect and your lender and see if it makes sense to split some of those spaces up, and just truly engaging with your tenants and understanding what their needs are, because sometimes tenants can have a huge increase in their sales just by making some small changes right now. So right now, I think we're seeing QSRs, which are quick service restaurants. Those are growing. You're seeing entertainment concepts where people can be socially distanced growing, and the need for contactless or omni-channel pickup. And if landlords are able to restripe their parking lot and comply with the fire codes and allow people to drive up and have things brought up to their car or additional pickup space in the back, those are all little changes that can make a huge difference. So every space is going to be different. If you're a multifamily landlord, obviously repositioning some of your tenants based on how they're doing in their specific career fields, their income needs, those are things that you should be looking at. Industrial tenants, or landlords, excuse me, probably have it the best right now because they still have demand, and it's projected that demand's going to grow. But whether it's Simon Malls that's looking at bringing in Amazon to their facility, or Five Below, they're starting to add esports training centers to their retail spaces. Every landlord has to play offense right now and has to be proactive and look at how can I increase my engagement with both my tenants and their customers.
Good advice. Travis, a big question here. How is Oklahoma City faring compared to other markets like LA and Dallas? And what advantages do we have in Oklahoma City that are minimizing or reducing the weight of the impact our developers might be feeling right now?
Yeah, Mike. One of the things that has probably frustrated a lot of ULI members over the past is actually one of our greatest strengths. Historically, when vacancy hits 10% in markets such as LA, Dallas, New York, what have you, you start seeing cranes and spec construction starts. Houston's a great example of that. And in Oklahoma City, if you look at lease rates in our market, when vacancy hit 10%, everyone just kind of stands pat. And so our lease rate is honestly more driven by inflation and less by spec construction and the things that create wild swings in rents in some of these primary markets. So the good news is, another kind of good news for Oklahoma City is we have vacancy, but we're not as overbuilt as cities like Houston. Like, for example, in the city of Houston right now, I think, Michael, this will surprise you, and I could be wrong by one or two spaces. If you were looking for a minimum of 100,000 square feet of contiguous office space, there are 17 options in downtown Houston right now. 17, which just speaks to, so imagine being a landlord in that market where you have 17 competitors looking for the same 100,000 square foot tenant who's less likely to sign a long-term lease right now. And that compounds and makes problem and just exasperates the problem and just further cuts lease rates. In Oklahoma City, because we're not as overbuilt and our development is typically much more measured, very rarely in our market do you see people do any kind of spec construction of any significance. Where compare that to Dallas or Houston, it happens all the time. So because we don't have that level of speculative construction, that will certainly help us ride out the storm. And another thing to look at is just the valuations. A lot of property valuations in our market, you rarely see above $200 a foot unless it's, a long-term sale leaseback with a CVS or someone like that, simply because it's hard to trade out of assets when you start to get above that $200 a square foot range, unless you're doing new construction, long-term net leases. And so because of that, when you look at sales of buildings, especially like in Northwest Oklahoma City, you don't see a huge spike. And so that's another good thing when you look at dealing with banks down the road. If you're in an asset for, let's call it $160 a foot, that means, you don't have to go get a lease rate number that just isn't commensurate with market. So I think that's one of the biggest differences between us and other markets when you consider how do we compare. For as much as we all at ULI would love to see cranes everywhere and new construction, it's really cool. It creates a lot of cool things to go look at. But in situations like this, it creates a lot of stress on those developers.
And it's stress that doesn't go away very quickly. Hey, Allison, I've got a question for you. You've been in this business of retail for a long time. Between optimistic and pessimistic, how would you describe the people you deal with day to day as tenants, as small business owners, as people who are getting into a business because they feel that this is the time to do it? Be real interested to hear more of your commentary on that.
I deal with a lot of small tenants. I prefer to work with a lot of small tenants and local tenants, and they're unceasingly optimistic. It really doesn't matter what the conditions are. By the time they've gotten to me, they've already believed in their idea enough to figure out how to build a spreadsheet around their expenses and their income. They're either looking at space, trying to decide if they could budget appropriately for the space that they want, or they've even made it past that point and they're ready to make a decision and have already created a budget, and they're trying to pick the best space within that budget. So that is something that I've been really surprised about. That optimism has continued. I've done a dozen leases this summer that are under 1,500 square feet. So that seems like a small amount of space, but it's a pretty decent size number of entrepreneurs that are either making a decision to open a space outside of their home, which has been a pretty popular trend, or they're trying to establish themselves for the first time, and they've left a firm that they were at to do their own thing. And so those small spaces are integral into creating the next round of entrepreneurs that are going to lease space from Travis or Germa later. Larger space, longer stable space. So always optimistic.
Mike,
That's Travis.
I just want to add to Allison. I don't think it should be, whenever you're creating an ecosystem, you need just as many, if not more, small tenants than you do big tenants to create a stable ecosystem. The small tenants will get coffee just as much as the big tenants. It allows to, when there is a tenant decides to make a move, it's not as big of a hit to not just that building, but just the general area. And so I don't think it should be, you cannot understate how important these leases that Allison is referencing. It is immeasurable how much of a positive impact that it has on the neighborhoods they're in and just the entire ecosystem of Oklahoma City. And so, it's important when you are looking at a new development to not just focus on, well, I need to go get that big lease. It's also, how can I go connect with smaller mom and pop businesses, because they're really going to help drive a neighborhood. And it just can't be undersold what Allison's doing.
Okay. Let's see, are we coming up on question and answer time?
Yeah, Mike, and if you have other questions, feel free to jump in as well. If they go along with, I'm going to start my video as well. If they go along with some of the questions that have come in from the audience, please feel free. We've got about a little less than 15 minutes before we're going to wrap up. So feel free to send some more questions in the chat if you have any questions that you'd like to be answered by the panel. One good question that we've touched on a little bit, both from some of the financing programs to the policies about streeteries. But what are some policies that you think the city, county, potentially even state should consider to adapt to what we'll call the new normal? I know the new normal is evolving by the day, what that looks like. But to help both the retail public environment thrive, in addition to office side, and I know it's a big topic, something to think through, but are there any ideas that you all have had that may be worth throwing out there? Because that's part of what we like to do with ULI. We like to throw out ideas and see if we can make them stick.
I would say, Travis. The alcohol and beverage law flexibility, having a little bit of flexibility so that tenants can adapt their, outdoor space to adapt barricades for alcohol and beverage laws, collaborate with other tenants, a little easier on outdoor space, pickup and delivery of those items. Some of those changes we've already seen this summer, but I thought that there's still room for that to evolve for small tenants, and for there to be more flexibility for them to make quicker changes in their operations.
Travis?
I was just going to say, I think whenever we're looking at policy, I think there's three parts to the stool when we're dealing with COVID. There's the public health there's the public health aspect that must be considered. There is the kind of personal health aspect considered, but at the end of the day, there's this third stool that's kind of economic health. And I guess I would be complimentary of our city government thus far of trying to consider and come up with solutions that are maybe good for public health, but aren't going to cripple these businesses. And I think we've done a good job of that. And so I think to continue to show flexibility, being able to submit permits online and things like that, I think are really good steps. And it's hard to you set rules because something happened in the past, but just trying to be as accommodating, understanding that we're just in an unforeseen situation and considering all three stools.
Anybody else?
I think that as humans, as business operators, people do a very good job of dealing with bad news if they understand what's taking place and they have a sense of clarity. And so I agree with what both Allison and Travis said. I think that I'm seeing a couple concepts that are heavily based in places like California that have just reached out to me and said, hey, we're closing down our Oklahoma City location because we have 18 of these in California and the numbers just don't work because Oklahoma is doing great, but the others aren't working. Then on the financial and the incentive aspect, especially with like the payment protection plan, there's multiple businesses that are having conversations currently that they're saying, we have enough money to last 4 more months, but we don't have enough money to last 4 more years. And we have no idea if there's another round of PPP or any other program coming. And I think that that's having devastating effect on businesses at this moment.
Certainly psychologically, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And Travis, you touched on something with the, sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. I'm going to go to another question. I'll touch back on that. We had, Travis, you touched on a little bit in this kind of more specific to the office market, but I want to expand on this, the idea of the advantages that Oklahoma City has over other markets. I'd love to hear anybody else's thoughts on that. I think that if you just even think of the idea of social distancing, we always talk about the Oklahoma City's urban planning and how our city was basically planned around the car. What that means as far as future planning remains to be seen in some ways, but there's the reality, even if it's simply rhetoric right now, but I think psychologically, larger markets like New York City, Chicago, were highly dense environments. Of course, we are always pushing for density under the right scale and the right form. However, that's one advantage that I think Oklahoma City and other mid-sized cities may have moving forward. But I'd like to open this to the group and just hear some thoughts on some positives that you think that the Oklahoma City Metro can gain from everything going on.
Just as a footnote to that, Cameron, one of the I read recently was the question of which has an interesting possible answers, but is density dead?
Can I speak to that? So during the CNU presentation, one of the speakers actually did a comparison, and they looked at places like Manhattan and the number of cases per capita, and looked at other areas across the country where density was at least 50% lower. And they saw over and over again that so much of it had to do with public policy and public health versus the actual density of the people living within a specific area. So by no means is density dead. I think that you'll definitely see a greater flexibility, and we've touched on a lot of those ways that will take place going forward in the future. And I think that smaller, more communal or public spaces will definitely become something that developers consider in the future pushing forward. As far as advantages, I think one of the greatest advantages, and we were talking earlier about why some of the landlords in some of the larger markets aren't working with their tenants. A lot of our owners here are local or mid-sized owners, and they're not a large national REIT or multi-billion-dollar company that have basically worked out their returns onto a spreadsheet and got those so thin that they have no room to be flexible. And as Travis alluded to, we don't wildly overbuild every time that we have an uptick. And so I think that those are two things that are going to be huge wins for us. And if our local businesses and our community tell their story, then we'll definitely continue to attract new people here.
Any other thoughts from the group on that?
I just got to give, I guess maybe this is more a shout out, Cameron, almost in a maybe sarcastic way, is we filled out our census forms. The fact that we are now rated as the 25th most populous city, getting on that list, I think means a lot. So it's kind of funny every time I hear people nationally say, hey, we got to fill out these census forms. Selfishly, as in Oklahoma City, and I'm like, no, don't fill them out, because for us to be 25th is awesome. And that means a lot in federal dollars for us. And again, as an Oklahoma City, and I'm biased, I want to see the best for our city. And being top 25 says a lot. Sometimes these companies just say, let's take the top 25 list and consider that. So I know it sounds crazy, but the mayor's not wrong. Being on that top 25 list is a big deal, not just from a recognition standpoint, but from a federal dollars standpoint. So that's good things. I think we got to continue to be proactive on our education system. The lack of qualified talent, even for standard jobs, is really scary. When you hear of local corporate homegrown companies like Love's and Paycom, and you hear their struggles to hire new talent, it's one thing for the chamber to go out and recruit Costco, and that's great. But if we can't keep our homegrown companies here and continue to add employees because they can't find qualified workforce, that's a big issue. So I know this isn't maybe a ULI issue per se, but if I would just hammer home, we've got to continue to look at all solutions as it comes to improving our education system for everyone in the communities. Because I think as we improve our education system, I think you'll see the city continue to be more attractive. I don't know if that's answering your question, but it's just.
No. And I think that's always worth hammering home, literally and figuratively, because it's the reality is it is a ULI issue, because the strength of our companies, the strength of our small business to large business is going to have effect on the real estate market, the commercial real estate market, the multifamily market. That was a great point. I have one more question, and then we're going to wrap it up. I've touched on this in past ULI programs that we've had virtually since everything hit back in March. But one thing I've been encouraged by is the level of entrepreneurship. Allison touched on it, just kind of she more than touched on it, the idea, the optimism that especially smaller independent businesses have had, and the resilience they've had just to think of their new idea, whether it's moving online or moving their patio outside, or as Travis touched on, Hogan Taylor, that this was pre-pandemic, but how they've figured out that model really works in this current environment. But I just like to ask the group, I think there's a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities that are going to come out of this, that either the people are thinking of, either they're forced to think of because they're laid off from a job, or they are just thinking of because we're forced into creativity to overcome these times. One example, it's not as much entrepreneurship, but and my question is to how this affects the commercial real estate market. And how that'll affect Oklahoma City, specifically the commercial real estate market, just kind of this ingenuity, this innovative mindset that I think is being forced due to the current environment. One local example that I've seen quite a bit of is some large property owners that have smaller properties that are offering those properties for sale to their tenants, especially to tenants that are doing well. and there's interest in by those tenants in the wealth building acquisition of a small commercial property that they're occupying. So I'm going to open that up. We only have a couple minutes, and then we will wrap things up.
I think these entrepreneurs that are kind of in the face of a pandemic wanting to start or grow their business, they're going to be vital in backfilling tenants that, honestly, this has been an emotional burden for a lot of business owners. And even if they make it through financially, they may not choose to continue to do their business when they're given an opportunity to either, ride out the end of their lease and choose to renew. And they may choose not to renew their leases and just say, I need time for my family. I need time for me to personally grow. I think business owners have felt the burden of having employees dependent on them this summer. And it has been really difficult for a lot of small business owners, especially entrepreneurs that are by themselves, or maybe just their spouse is their partner in the business. And so there's going to be some natural attrition, even if they make it through over the next few years. And I think these small entrepreneurs, we have to foster these ideas wherever we can get them, because a few of them are going to make it, and we need those people to kind of regenerate what's going to happen over the next 5 years with our existing businesses. So.
Any other thoughts there? Okay, guys. First of all, thank you to our panel. I know we can't all clap, so I'm just going to snap. This was fantastic. The knowledge that you all bring is incredible. Michelle and I were chatting on the side, and we said we could listen to this all day. Not only is it relevant, but there's just so much knowledge pouring out of each one of you, and you're seeing it on the ground, seeing what's happening. So thank you for taking your time out of your day to do this. And this is going to be a continued discussion. The reality is 6 months from now, it's going to look very different than where we are right now. And we just don't know exactly what that looks like. But this is something that we need to have these relevant discussions through ULI, through other organizations, to make sure that everybody here is hearing what you're hearing. And so thank you to Michael and each one of you for being a part of this today. And thank you to everyone else for joining. As I said at the beginning, if you didn't hear ULI, this is the reason we do this is, and I say we do this both from a staff side with Michelle and Maddie to our volunteers that help put these programs together, is because it's important for our market, it's important for our city, it's important for our communities, our businesses, our anyone involved. And so thank you for joining, and please feel free to share this video. It is recorded, and it will be through ULI Oklahoma's site, our events page. The link will be there. Thanks a lot, and thanks again to our sponsors and everyone. Have a safe week, and we will see you soon.